Good morning, Morai Rabotai. We are continuing on Mesechet Avodah Zarah, and we are starting the last Mishnah of the Mesechet, Daf Ayin Hey Amud Bet, towards the top of the Amud. Today's Amud is being learned. Lischut Refuah Shelema, Rachel Simcha Bat Nahid. The upcoming surgery, Bezrat Hashem, should be the Refuah Shelema. Amen. This is a very interesting part. The Mishnah is going to discuss now as the last piece of the Mesechet, after having discussed all the four parts of Mesechet Avodah Zarah. The last nugget is the Hachsher Kelim of the Avodah Zarah, the kosherizing of the Kelim of the Avodah Zarah, but not just kosherizing in the way we usually deal with them as Hag'ala and Libun, but rather another element that we learn from Klei Midyan, which is Tevilat Kelim. The Sugya of Tevilat Kelim in Shas is mentioned here in the last page of Mesechet Avodah Zarah, that perhaps a new or old vessel that is bought from a goy has to be first dunked in a mikveh kasher, in a kosher mikveh, before being used by a Jew. Now, whether or not this is the Oraita, the Rabbanan, becomes a very interesting and involved Machloket Rishonim. And of course, Maran of Shulchan Aruch will jump the gun. Maran of Shulchan Aruch in the Halachot of Tevilat Kelim, Siman Kuf Chav in Yoreh De'ah, in Sif Tet and Yud Bet, in two places Maran clearly indicates that Tevilat Kelim is an Inyan, the Oraita is a biblical concept, and therefore it's of course important not just to learn about it, but to know some of the details as well. And hence we start the Mishnah. Says the Mishnah, Halokeach kli tashmish min avdei kochavim. If you get a kli tashmish, we will see in the Gemara that kli tashmish over here only refers to klei seudah. It means if you get a hammer from a goy, you don't have to do Tevilat Kelim on a hammer. It's only klei seudah, things that are used for food purposes, that are considered klei tashmish. Now, you also have sometimes a gray area. What if I am buying from a goy scissors that are usually meant for cutting wool and cutting material, and now I'm going to be cutting chicken and meat and so on? That's what primarily I'm buying it for food. But it was not necessarily meant for food, or maybe the goy is secondhand, the goy was not using it for food. That becomes, of course, a great question. But says the Gemara, says the Mishnah, if you get klei tashmish, vessels from a goy, if all that is remained is only Tevilat Kelim, which means there is no hechsher to be done outside of Tevilat Kelim. You get a cup, it's always used with cold, there is no bliot inside, and therefore you just rinse it off. There's no hechsher of hag'ala, there is no hechsher of libun, you don't have to put it in bubbling water, you don't have to stick it in the oven. So then the only thing that's left is Tevilat Kelim, and says the Mishnah, Yatbil. You do Tevilat Kelim. But however, lehag'il yag'il lelaben ba'ur lelaben ba'ur. If you need to also do additional hechsher prior to dunking this in the mikveh, then you have to, of course, do that first, and then you do Tevilat Kelim. So if you have a pot, for instance, that you cook in it, so that the halacha is, you need to do haga'ala on it. We know kebol'o kach bolto. The way a vessel takes the bli'ot, takes the taste and the traces of food in, the same way it would also get rid of them and give them out. So if therefore a vessel has been used with water, cooking material, or oil, meaning we're talking about deep oil frying, then you would do a hagala and you're good to go. But sometimes you have items that are used on fire without any liquid, right? Like the shpudim v'askelaot, things that are made for the metal vessels that are made for roasting on fire, whether it's the nets that you do barbecue on or the kebab stuff that you have to poke the meat inside and so on. All of those are not used with liquid, directly on fire. Then you need libun. You need to glow them red in fire, and that will be the hechsher. So if you're using any of those material, you have to decide based on the usage of the vessel. You first kosherize it before Tevilat Kelim, says the Mishnah. Hashfud ve'askala melabenan ba'or hasakin shafa ve'iteora. The Mishnah gives examples over here. The Rishonim ask why you need examples for libun, but nevertheless, the Mishnah says if you have shpudim v'askelaot that are used directly on fire for roasting purposes of the meat without any liquids, of course you would have to do libun chamur, which would be you heat them to glow on fire, and that's the hechsher. And then of course afterwards you'll do tevilat kelim. And says the last part of the Mishnah, hasakin shafa ve'iteora. One exception to those things that are used cold is sakin. If you have a knife, which is always used cold, you have never cut with it something treif that is hot, but nevertheless, washing it is not sufficient because the way the Ran explains this, duchka de sakina, when you have a sakin which is sharp and it's always used with pressure, that pressure makes it take on the taste of the treif food that it has been used with, more so than just washing would suffice for the kosherizing. So therefore you have to smoothen the surface of it. Now either you have to stick it into hard ground 10 times or use a actual tool to scrape the surface of it a little bit to the sharpening items that they had back in the day. That would also suffice. So says the Gemara, we learned that all of these they need tevilah in 40 sa'ah. 40 sa'ah, of course, we all are familiar with from tevilat nida. A nida has to go in a minimum amount of water of 40 sa'ah, like a large amount of water. Now, why is this a chidush? As we'll see later in the Gemara, the chidush is because, for instance, just for bringing this to real life, the Gemara in Psachim, Daf Yud Zayin, when discussing the halachot of tum'ah v'tahara, and the Gemara discusses that if you have a little needle, then you don't need 40 sa'ah. A revi'it is sufficient, as the Tosafot discusses over here. A revi'it of water for tum'ah v'tahara, a revi'it of kosher water. It's connected with the mayim, the water of, for instance, a spring of water, which is mayim hayim. If you have a little bit of it in the ground indentation and you put the needle on, good. But when it comes to tevilat kelim, not so quick. You would need a mikveh of 40 sa'ah. You need a body of water that a woman who is nida could use that for their tevilah. So says the Gemara, Menahanemidi, who says that this should be any different than tum'ah v'tahara? So says the Gemara, Amar Rava, Damar Kra. Rava says because we learned this from the pasuk. Now, this pasuk is the central pasuk when it comes to tevilat kelim. This is after the war with the Midian, after the whole story at the end of the 40 years of what happened with Pinchas and the 24,000 casualties of the Magefah that happened by Benot Midian. Of course, they went and they fought and destroyed and dismantled Midian, and then they brought tremendous amount of booty, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu directs them how to deal with the clay Midian. The pasuk says, "Kol davar asher yavo ba'esh ta'aviru ba'esh." Anything that would come in contact with fire, that means it's used normally on fire, like we mentioned, the barbecue metals that the food touches, ta'aviru ba'esh. You have to pass them through fire, and the hechsher would happen in that way. And then at the end it says, in the same pasuk, ach b'meh nida yitchata. But it should also be kosherized through meh nida. Now, me and you, if we would read this pasuk in the vacuum, we would say that the reference of the pasuk is like any other place that you have menida. What's menida? Normally speaking, we're talking about sprinkling of para aduma, right? Menida itchata, that means you have to sprinkle it with para aduma, which some of the Rishonim, those who say the concept of tevilat kelim is midrabanan, they actually read this pasuk like that. They said the Torah is not talking about tevilat kelim. The Torah is talking about the case that you went and you killed people, and many of these vessels that you have brought from Midian, they touched corpses of people. And therefore, they are tameh met. They have the tum'ah of a corpse, of a vessel that has touched a corpse. Hence, you have to have shlishi v'shvi'i on the third and the seventh day, sprinkling of para aduma's ashes. Right? That's how we would learn it. But now let's see what the Gemara does with this. Says the Gemara, Kol davar asher yavo ba'esh taviru ba'esh v'taher. Now, the first part of the pasuk has an extra word. Me and you would write the pasuk, Kol asher yavo ba'esh taviru ba'esh. Right. Anything that is used by fire, pass it through fire. Nekuda. End of the sentence. But the Torah adds one word, v'taher. And it will become tahor. I mean, you are talking about that after all, so you don't have to tell me. It's certainly superfluous to say v'taher. So says the Gemara, why does the pasuk have an extra word v'taher? Hosif lecha katuv tahara acheret. The Torah is coming to teach you that that's not the only tahara, but there is another tahara that for this vessel that is needed, and that is tahara in the mikveh. You need to dunk this vessel after you pass it through fire, and now you took care of the actual non-kosher traces of food that are inside there. Now you have to dunk it in the mikveh. There's an additional tahara needed for it as well. So says the Gemara, Tani bar kapara, the Yeshiva bar kapara learned, Mitoch shenemar b'menida, from the fact that the pasuk says menida, as we mentioned before, me and you would read the pasuk and say, well, this is talking about tumat met, 7 days of count, the sprinkling of paraduma's ashes on the third and seventh day, hazaku baruch. That's what we would say. Talmud lomar, ach b'menida itchata. Why do you have to say ach? We know throughout Shas, achin verakin, whenever it says ach or it says rak, it is coming to be mema'it. It's coming to take away from what you would have thought. So says the Gemara, why do you have to say ach? Read the pasuk with me, look inside even. It should say, taviru ba'esh v'taher, ubemen ida itchata. Additionally, it should be sprinkled with paraduma's ashes. Why do you have to say ach, but b'mei nida nitchata, which clearly every single place that ach is mentioned in the Torah is coming to take away from what you would have thought. So says the Gemara, Talmud Omar ach chalak is differentiating between this and what you would have thought. So it's coming to tell you that no, you don't need the sprinkles of paraduma. So you would ask, why do you have to say menida itchata? The pasuk says you have to have menida. So what does that mean? Menida, generally speaking, is a reference to efer paraduma, to the sprinkling of efer paraduma. So says the Gemara, Ma Talmud lomar b'menida, mayim shenida tovelet bahen. It's talking about the water that a woman who is nida would go dunk in tevilah of nida. That's what. So you need for tevilat kelim a mikveh that's kosher for nida. Now you have this, of course, in parentheses. It's very important which mikveh for tevilat kelim you use, right? Sometimes you have a mikveh that's meant only for men, right? And there have been certain kulas, certain leniencies that have been, built in, so to speak, that a lot of things work for men. You could go to a swimming pool also for men's mikveh. But then if people start using it for Tevilat Kelim, then you've got a problem. Because Tevilat Kelim, especially according to Maran Shcharuch, as we mentioned, being the Oraita, you need to make sure that you have the best mikveh that's kosher for a woman's mikveh in order to dunk Kelim inside of it as well. So that, the Gemara says, is the limud. Ach b'meni da'it chata means it has to be a kosher tefillah pool for women. So says the Gemara, Have Omer, so it says, the Gemara says, now you have two things to learn from, right? Have Omer arba'im sa'ah. You need arba'im sa'ah just like you need also for Tevilat Kelim. And the Gemara says, Istrich lemichtav v'taher v'istrich lemichtav b'menida. We have now two limudim, right? We just mentioned in past 3 minutes that there are two elements in this same pasuk that we learn from them that you need Tevilat Kelim. A, the beginning of the pasuk that says Yavo ba'esh v'taher, right? That you have an extra word v'taher to teach you that you need tahara acheret, you need to dunk it in the mikveh. And then you have b'menidait chata, that you have to bring it into a woman's mikveh, so to speak, for it to be kasher. So why do you have to say two things? Just tell me ach b'menidait chata, and I know. Or just tell me v'taher, and I'll know. Why do you need both of them to teach me the halachot of Tevilat Kelim? Says the Gemara, very simple. Because iktiv v'taher, if the pasuk would not say ach bemen nida'it chata, will just tell me the first part of v'taher, then I would say v'tahava amina v'taher kol dehu. I would say, just like we mentioned from the Gemara in Pesachim Daf Yud Zayin, by tum'ah v'tahara, that if you want a needle, you could put it in a little ma'im chayim, in a little container in the ground that's attached to ma'im chayim, and that would be sufficient. That's what I would say. Says the Gemara, Katav Rachmana b'menida, Hashem writes, b'menida, to tell you, no. You need arba'im sa, you need a legitimate mikveh that a person, a human being, could be using as well. And if it would only say, b'menida itchata, that would, the chora, we would think that should at least be good. Ve'katav rachmana b'menida. If you would say only b'menida itchata, then hava mina harav shemesh kenida. Then I would say you require all of the halachot that a nida requires. So, for instance, the nida in the Torah level of the tevilah of nida, she could go in the Yom HaShvi'i during the day. Nowadays, that's of course not applicable. Please do not make any mistakes, because nowadays it's much more complex with the halachot of zava, which needs to wait until the night, right? But in only nida, not talking about nowadays women going to mikveh, in the biblical only nida, not zava mixed with it, she could go to mikveh during the day of the seventh day, but then she would have, if she wants to have terumah, she has to wait until night. She's not tahor completely until nightfall, even after she dunks in the mikveh. So I would have thought that by Tevilat Kelim also should be the same. Now if 2 o'clock in the afternoon you did the Tevilat Kelim, you cannot use it until nighttime, right? Because you learned it from the mikveh of the woman. And all the halachot of menida should be applicable to this. Therefore, the pasuk has to come and tell you an extra word of v'taher that is tahor immediately. You dunk it in the mikveh, next second you could use it. It is immediate tahara achieved by mikveh, and that's how it differs from the menida of a woman going to mikveh. Fine. Says the Gemara. It's coming to tell you with the word taher that it's immediate, that's achieved, the tahara of the kli is achieved immediately. Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Rabba bar Avuha. Rav Nachman said in the name of Rabba bar Avuha, Afilu kelim chadashim b'mashma. It's not only old vessels of the goyim, even a brand new with a plastic wrap that you buy from this store, still you need Tevilat Kelim. Even though that there's no pliot, there's no traces of not kosher food, it's mamash brand new, still you need to do a Tevilat Kelim. Now nowadays, just in parenthesis, some of the new ones also you need to do hagala on before, because they smear them with, in order for them to be stick and span, they have in the process of making them, they smear them with all kinds of professional commercial greasing, which could be also tarif. So that's something just in parentheses for a person to know. But nevertheless, the ha-yeshanim, how do I know that new ones also need tevilah? Because yeshanim v'li benan k'chadashim damu. Halachically speaking, if I have something that is old with all the traces of food, and I glow this heat to heat it to glow, and now I did libun chamur, that halachically is like a brand new kli, because everything that was there is completely burnt. And yet, do I have to do tevilat kelim on it? Absolutely yes. So therefore, you see, says the Gemara, that tevilat kelim has nothing to do with kosherizing from the traces of food. Has nothing to do with that. It's coming from the tum'ah of the goy to the kedusha of Yisrael. Right? It's a level of kedusha that has to be achieved. By the way, that's why we make bracha on it. On kosherizing, we don't make bracha, because that's just getting rid of negativity. But when you elevate something in kedusha, that's when you say a bracha, hence the bracha on tevilat kelim. But says the Gemara, va'afilu achi by tevilah. Even after libun, you need tevilat kelim, and therefore, by a new vessel, would be the same thing. Matkifla, Rav Sheshet. Rav Sheshet asked a question on this. Yachi afilu zuza de sarbalanami. If that's correct, that you even need tevilat kelim by a vessel that has not been used with food, and hence doesn't have any traces of food in it, so even a pair of scissors that you cut wool with should need tevilat kelim. But we don't do that, says Rav Sheshet. So maybe you have to reconsider your drasha. Says Gemara, no, absolutely not. Amale kle seudam amurim beparasha. Look at the parasha is only talking about vessels used for food. Kle seudah. So your hammer and your scissors and your other vessels, they don't need to be dunked in the mikveh, because they're not food items. They're not utensils used with food. So says the Gemara, Amar Rab Nachman, Amar Rabba bar Avuam, Lo shanu ela belekuchin uch maaseh shehaya, aval sheulin lo. Another chidush is, this is only something that belongs to you. Lekuchin, you take it and you take possession of it. That's when it is required to do tevilat kelim. But if you borrow a vessel from a goy, then you don't need necessarily to do that. You don't need, it's patur. You're borrowing a vessel from a goy, then it's patur from tevilat kelim, no need of tevilat kelim. Now this, of course, has, well, the Rav Tzvi Safran has a tshuva. How about if you take it from hefker, right? And then perhaps you should, but this borrowing business actually becomes something that is used as a legal loophole that Maran Bet Yosef, both in Orach Chaim in Siman Shin Chav Gimal and also in Yeredah Siman Kuf Chav, uses for when you have your back against the wall. For instance, the example of Maran is, it's Erev Shabbat, or it's on Shabbat, you remember you need to use something, right? And you can't do Tevilat Kelim on Shabbat, right? You can't be metakenically. So, says Maran, you give it as a gift to a goy, and you borrow it from them. Maran writes that you should not be relying on this on after Shabbat. You should go take it back and go take it to mikveh. Right? This is not something that you use. This is a legal loophole. That's what it is, and it should not be used on regular. But for instance, the digital items that we have nowadays, many of which they would actually break if you use them with water. If you dunk them in the water, the entire thing would be dead by the time you take it out of mikveh, right? So those things, of course, you're not required to break the kli. This becomes the Avnei Nezer, many other Gdolim who wrote about things that will break if you put them in the mikveh. What do you do with it? Especially if you say Tevilat Kelim is midoraita. So one of the ideas that are brought in the Svarim is give it to a goy, borrow it from them, because the Gemara says on borrowed items you have no chiyuv of Tevilat Kelim, and even though that's only when you have your back against the wall, you don't want it looks like chuchaut lula, it looks like a very not legit thing to give it to them. So yeah, it's yours, and now can I borrow it for perpetuity, for forever? So that of course does not sound legit, but nevertheless, if that's the only solution that exists, then it could become perhaps an idea as well. We'll discuss this in the halachic talk that we'll have about plugging in the Chelkat Yaakov, Rabbi Yaakov Mordechai Breish, and others, which is a fascinating talk, Be'ezrat Hashem, that we will have. So, says the Gemara. Let's do one more line. Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Yosef Zavin Mara de Marda Me'ovet Kochavim. Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Yosef bought a vessel that was made out of dirt and animal waste. That's how they used to actually dry them. It was something that they used, and he wanted to do Tevilat Kelim on this, right? So it says the Gemara, Amar le Haum Rabbanan. Rabbi Yaakov Shemeh. Rabbi Yaakov tells him, I heard directly in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that the pasuk in Kile Midyan is talking about Kile Matechot only. Only vessels that are made out of metal are included in this. So this dirt, Kile Adama, which with animal dung, is not considered something that you need to do a tevilah on. Amar Rav Ashi has another layer of chidush over here. Hani kle zechuchit, that glass items, glass vessels, ho'il v'chi nishtabru yesh lahem takana, because they share the same element of in their nature as metal. That just like metal, if they break, you could melt it and you could reuse it and remake it. Zechuchit also is like that. If it breaks, you can melt it and make it again. So therefore, keli matechot damu. It's like keli matechot, perhaps midrabanan only, but nevertheless, they will require tevilat kelim. So it's not just metal, but it's metal and also is included in it kli zechuchit, perhaps midrabanan. And the next item, which is very interesting, the Gemara is going to discuss, is how about if I have earthenware, china, but the china, back in the time of the Chazal, it would have a layer of metal covering it on the top. Nowadays, the china, again, the time of Aruch HaShulchan, in 200-300 years past, it used to be a thick layer of glass. Nowadays, there's a glaze on china. How about if I have the actual vessel made out of something that's patur from Tevilat Kelim, like earthenware, like china, but on top of it is covered with metal or with glass, for that matter, for our purposes? What happens then? Do you say we go after the ikar of the kli, which is earthenware and should be patur, or do we go after the coating that actually touches the food, which is metal or glass, that will be chayav? That's the next topic in the Gemara, a fascinating topic. We'll start with that in the next year.